I thought marrying a younger woman would bring new life to my quiet ranch. I never expected to overhear her plotting my murder with a biker gang. Hey everyone, thanks for being here again. It truly means a lot. Before I dive into today's story, I've got a bit of news I'm really excited to share. I recently started a YouTube channel called Soulfell Chronicles, where I'll be telling more of these real, emotional stories that dig deep into life and love. If you found anything here that speaks to you, I'd be grateful if you checked it out, gave it a thumbs up, maybe even subscribed. You can find the link down in the description. Alright, let's get into it. Looking back now, I realize I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life when I married Sharon. And if I'm being honest, I've got no one to blame but myself. That winter, the isolation got under my skin. It crept in slowly, gnawed at me in the quiet hours, and made everything feel colder and emptier than it really was. So when I met Sharon at a Christmas gathering, one of those festive, boozy parties filled with laughter and dim lights, I let my guard down. I let myself get pulled in by her energy. She was magnetic, almost too much to handle. And for a man like me, nearly 40 and starting to feel the weight of time on his shoulders, her youthful spirit felt like hitting the reset button. She was in her early 20s, wild and free-spirited, and had this spark that made everything around her feel electric. At the time, it felt like exactly what I needed. My world out on the ranch had grown still and quiet, and here was Sharon, this bright, fast-burning flame, lighting it all up again. She made me feel alive, like maybe I wasn't past my prime after all. My buddies, they saw things differently. They tried to wave me off, not always directly but in their own way. A few of them dropped little hints, mentioned rumors they'd heard about her time in the city. Her past wasn't spotless and they made sure I knew that. She wasn't cut out for this kind of life, they said. She was a city girl to her bones. But I didn't listen. I didn't want to. I told myself they just didn't understand. I believed, deep down, maybe desperately, that what I felt was love. So I charged ahead, blind to every warning sign. And for a while, it worked. Or at least it seemed to. The early days were filled with a kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years. We laughed a lot. Went on spontaneous trips. Talked late into the night. For a moment I thought I'd made the right call, that I'd finally figured out what happiness really looked like. But those moments didn't last. Slowly, piece by piece, the cracks started to show, and once they did, they only got wider. The ranch, my ranch, was everything to me. 100 acres of fertile, rolling land about an hour outside of Houston. I'd poured my heart into it, built it up from scratch, and under my watch, it had become something to be proud of. It earned a steady income, but the bulk of my money came from managing 6 other ranches for some high-powered city folks. Doctors, lawyers, corporate bigwigs, people who liked to brag about owning land but rarely stepped foot on it. I kept their operations running smoothly, managed their hired hands, and made sure the books stayed in the black. And for that, they paid me well, more than enough to build a comfortable life. Over the years, I'd saved every extra dollar I could. I wasn't flashy. I didn't splurge. I just tucked it away, built up a solid safety net for the future. That nest egg became my lifeline, because when Sharon moved in, that nest egg I had worked so hard to build, I never added another cent to it. Not one. It was like trying to fill a leaking bucket. Every dollar I earned vanished just as fast as it came in. To put it plainly, Sharon had expensive tastes and she didn't exactly hide it. The slow pace of ranch life wore on her nerves almost immediately. Within a few short weeks, she was already talking about how bored she was, how she missed the energy of the city. Soon enough, she was making near-daily trips into Houston, usually under the pretense of running errands or clearing her head. But the truth was, sometimes she wouldn't come home for days. When I asked, she'd say she stayed at her old condo, the same one she never bothered to sell after we got married. I thought that was strange back then, but now, it makes all the sense in the world. There were rumors, of course. Folks whispered that she was reconnecting with people from her past. Old friends, old flings, nobody could say for sure. And Sharon? She was careful. Always just clever enough to cover her tracks, never leaving behind anything concrete I could hold up as proof. By the time we hit our 3rd year together, she'd completely stopped pretending to care about money. Budgets meant nothing to her. She would run up one stack of credit cards until they hit their limit, and when I stepped in, cut them up, tried to set boundaries, she just went behind my back and opened new ones. No conversation, no explanation, just more debt piling up. Then came the call that changed everything. My banker, a guy named Craig I'd known since high school, rang me up one morning. He didn't sound like himself. His voice was tight, like he was choosing his words carefully. Turns out, Sharon had waltzed into the bank and tried to access my personal savings. She even went so far as to forge my signature. I was stunned. If Craig hadn't been the one handling the paperwork, she might have gotten away with it. I acted fast after that. I changed all my account numbers, set up extra security protocols, and made it so that no money could be pulled without me being there in person. Thankfully, the money was still there. She hadn't gotten to it. But that was about the only thing left untouched. Not long after that, I started noticing things going missing around the house. At first, it was just little things, decorations, some antiques that had been passed down through my family, old but meaningful. I figured maybe she packed them away or moved them. But then my mother's jewelry started to disappear. I'd given it to Sharon as a wedding gift, something sentimental I thought she'd cherish. One by one, those pieces vanished. When I confronted her, she acted devastated, said she had no idea what I was talking about, swore someone must have stolen them. She made herself out to be the victim, like I was accusing her without reason. But deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to admit it. The arguments got worse after that. Louder. More personal. There were nights I came close to kicking her out for good. But every time she'd cry, apologize, swear she was done with the spending, that she wanted to be better. For me, for us. And for a little while, I believed her. Or maybe I just wanted to. But something in me had changed. I'd seen enough to know the truth. She wasn't trying to fix things. She was just biding her time, waiting for her next chance to take what she could. By then, even the people in town had started to notice. Folks who used to keep their thoughts to themselves started pulling me aside, telling me quietly that I didn't deserve what she was putting me through. Divorce didn't carry the same shame it once did, not like in my parents' day. And more than one person told me straight up, I'd be better off without her. Eventually, I knew I couldn't keep living like that, waiting for the other shoe to drop, walking on eggshells in my own home. So I went and spoke to a lawyer about getting a legal separation. My main goal was making sure that everything I'd worked for before the marriage stayed mine. I wanted to protect my land, my savings, my peace of mind. But Sharon wasn't just after the money. She had her sights set on the property too, and under Texas law, she had a real claim to it, especially after living there for a few years. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew if I pulled the trigger too soon, she'd drag me through the courts and leave me bleeding financially. I wasn't ready to make that leap. Not yet. Not without a solid plan, something that wouldn't leave me standing alone on an empty plot of land with nothing but regrets. Then something unexpected happened, something I never could have predicted. That spring, one of the larger ranches I managed, owned by a well-known criminal defense lawyer out of Houston, hosted a group of guests. And these weren't your average weekend visitors. They were part of a regional biker gang, guys who had reputations that stretched beyond the county lines. Their leader had just dodged a serious assault conviction, and they were using the ranch to celebrate that victory, while also getting back to their usual business. I didn't ask questions. I kept to myself, handled my responsibilities, and made sure not to interfere with whatever they were doing. They seemed to understand I had a job to do, and for the most part, they left me alone. But I wasn't naive. I knew trouble when I smelled it. And I mean that literally. One of the barns had a stench that made the hair on my arms stand up. Something chemical, rotten, unnatural. I wasn't a chemist, but I'd seen enough movies and heard enough stories to have a good guess. Whatever they were cooking in there, it wasn't moonshine. One night, half out of stress and half just trying to feel heard, I brought it up to Sharon. I told her something shady was going on over there, that it smelled like trouble, illegal kind of trouble. I didn't dwell on it though. Calving season was in full swing and I barely had time to sleep, let alone chase shadows. I was stretched so thin I didn't notice what was happening right under my nose. And I never imagined Sharon would get involved. Not with them. I only found out by pure accident. It was late one evening. I was digging around the loft of that same attorney's barn, looking for an old hinge I thought I'd stored up there. One of the cattle gates on my property had come loose, and I was hoping to avoid a trip into town. The place was quiet. The bikers had ridden out earlier and I figured I had a rare moment of peace. But just as I was getting ready to leave, I heard the low, grumbling thunder of their bikes echoing back down the road. Instinct kicked in and I ducked back into the shadows, crouching behind a stack of hay bales. I didn't know why I hid. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was caution, but I stayed still and waited. Then I saw her. Sharon. She came riding in on the back of the gang leader's bike, her arms draped around him like they'd done it 1,000 times before. She looked like she belonged there, like that was her place now. She was wearing this pair of cut-off denim shorts that barely qualified as clothing, and a halter top tied just below her chest, most of the buttons undone. She wasn't dressed like someone's wife. She looked like a groupie, like someone trying to turn heads. And mine did. But not for the reasons she wanted. My gut clenched. I felt sick. It was like the floor dropped out from under me. That moment, that image of her with him, smiling, comfortable, it's burned into my memory. I stayed put, frozen in place, and slowly stepped deeper into the shadows of the loft, easing myself into the darkest corner I could find. The barn doors were wide open below, and with the loft windows cracked, I had a clear line of sound to everything going on down there. They spoke without filters, like they didn't have a care in the world, and certainly no idea anyone else might be listening. And they talked freely, especially in front of Sharon. They were discussing the full scope of their operation. Not just what they'd already done, but what was coming next. Plans, routes, distribution points, all of it. This wasn't just a pit stop for these guys, they were laying roots. And Sharon? She wasn't just watching from the sidelines. She was in it. She asked questions. She laughed at their jokes. She even gave suggestions. And then came the part that nearly broke me. She told them she was planning to ride out with them when they left. Like it was already decided. As the night dragged on, the atmosphere in the barn shifted from celebratory to something far more reckless. The alcohol was flowing like water, and before long the party turned wild, unrestrained. The boundaries between fun and something darker started to vanish. People paired off in corners, and what they did wasn't subtle. There were no secrets, no shame. Public affection turned graphic, loud, and messy. I shut my eyes and clenched my jaw, trying to block it out, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. Every part of me burned with anger, but I had to know the full truth. I had to see what Sharon had become when she thought I wasn't watching. Then it happened. Mike, the leader of the gang, reached out and took Sharon by the hand. She giggled, smiling in that carefree way I hadn't seen in a long time, and let him guide her across the barn floor. But instead of heading out like I prayed they would, they started climbing the stairs, up toward me. My stomach twisted as I realized where they were headed, straight to the loft. Right to where I was hidden. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I pressed myself flat against the support beams, every muscle in my body tensed like a coiled spring. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. In those seconds before they reached the top, I spotted a narrow space between two massive hay bales and slipped into it, just barely concealed from view. From there I couldn't see them, but I could hear everything. And what I heard tore into me deeper than I thought anything ever could. They didn't hold back. Not in words. Not in sound. And I was forced to lay there in the dark, listening to the woman I had once trusted above all else give herself to another man, not quietly, not behind closed doors, but brazenly, like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. It went on far longer than I could stand. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard more. Not from that night, but from their conversations afterward. Turns out, Sharon hadn't just taken up with Mike. This was a full-blown initiation. She'd already been with several of them, men and women alike, earlier in the week. It was part of earning her place, as they put it. She had thrown herself headfirst into their world without hesitation. It was gut-wrenching. But as I lay there, hidden in that dusty loft, fists clenched and heart shattered, I knew one thing for certain. Every second of that agony had served a purpose. Now I had proof. Maybe not in the way I expected, maybe not something I could use in court, but enough to know I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being paranoid. Sharon had made her choice. And this time I would be the one making the next move. That night, still hidden in the shadows of the loft, I overheard something that chilled me more than anything I'd ever faced. Not even the betrayal could compare. I learned that Sharon and Mike were planning to kill me. They weren't just using me for money or to live some double life. They intended to end mine. In just 2 days they were set to head out on a major drug run to Arkansas, and before they left I was supposed to be gone for good. What made my blood run cold was how calmly they talked about it. Sharon had taken out a large life insurance policy on me a few months prior. I remember when she brought it up, told me it was just in case something ever happened, part of planning for our future. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now I saw it for what it was, a setup. Their plan involved some new synthetic drug. A designer compound that triggered heart failure but supposedly left no trace in the system. According to Mike, no current medical tests could detect it. That meant they could pass it off as a natural death. Me, a middle-aged rancher who had maybe worked himself too hard. It would look like a tragic accident. And they'd walk away clean, pockets full of insurance money and no questions asked. But that wasn't all. Even if they didn't kill me for the payout, I was still a problem they needed to erase. I knew too much. I'd overheard enough that I could have brought the whole operation crashing down, and they knew it. They had it all mapped out. Sharon would take one of her usual trips to the city, gone for a week or two. While she was away, I'd suddenly die of a heart attack. When she returned, she'd play the devastated widow. She'd claim the insurance, take ownership of the ranch, and step fully into her new life, with Mike and his gang there to help her grieve and enjoy the wealth they'd stolen. Tomorrow, just a few hours from now, she and a gang member named Butcher were planning to slip the poison into as much of the kitchen food and drinks as they could. No subtlety. No finesse. Just enough to ensure I didn't see the next sunrise. Cleanup could come later. Their priority was simple: get rid of me. Around midnight, they finished their disgusting rendezvous, laughing and stumbling their way back to the house like nothing was out of the ordinary. I stayed hidden for hours after they left. My muscles ached from being cramped so long, but I didn't move until the barn and surrounding fields were completely silent again. Then, keeping low and taking a wide, indirect path, I crept back home, avoiding the roads, the lights, anything that could expose me. When I finally made it to the house, I didn't go inside. I just sat outside, tucked behind the workshop, back against the wall, trying to breathe, trying to think. What was I supposed to do? That question looped through my head like a broken record. I could run. I could file for divorce, give her half the ranch, maybe more, and disappear. But that wouldn't keep me safe. They'd still come after me because I was a liability now. From the way Mike spoke, it was clear he and Sharon were just pawns in a much bigger operation. Whatever they were a part of, it went far beyond the county line. These people had connections. The kind of connections that made people like me vanish without a trace. I sat there, the cool night air pressing against my skin, heart still pounding like a war drum. I needed to think. I needed clarity. I needed a drink. But I wasn't much of a drinker. I knew I needed to stay sharp. As tempting as a drink might have been to settle my nerves, I needed every ounce of clarity I could get. Sharon always kept a bottle of Southern Comfort tucked away in the pantry, her favorite. I never liked the stuff. It always reminded me of cough syrup, too sweet and medicinal. But in that moment it wasn't about taste. It was about trust. And I didn't trust a single thing in that house anymore. Not the food. Not the drinks. Not even the coffee. Maybe the tap water. Funny enough, that's what gave me the idea. Just before the sun crept over the horizon, I made a quiet trip out to the main barn where I kept my office and vet supplies. The place was still, bathed in that eerie blue light that comes just before dawn. I slipped inside and made my way to the small refrigerator I use for animal medicine. The shelves were packed with vials and bottles, most of them clearly marked for livestock use only. Stuff that would be downright dangerous for a person. But I wasn't looking for something deadly. I wasn't out for revenge. I needed something that would knock them off their feet just long enough for the sheriff's department to catch them red-handed. They had to be alive, sick sure but alive, when the law showed up to find their lab and whatever else they were hiding. As I scanned the contents, my eyes caught an old amber bottle way in the back. The label had mostly worn off with time, but the shape was familiar. I knew what it was. Years ago, my vet had given it to me, an experimental dewormer for a cow that wouldn't respond to the regular stuff. I remembered it well because it had worked a little too well. One tiny dropper full had been enough to drop a 1,400-pound animal to the ground for the better part of a day. For a human, just a few drops would be more than enough. I had no idea how much Sharon or Mike, or any of them for that matter, might drink. So I played it safe but not too safe. I opened the bottle of whiskey Sharon had left on the table, poured in half the contents of the dewormer, gave it a gentle swirl, and set it back like nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, still holding the bottle of veterinary solution, trying to figure out what my next move should be. My mind was racing. Where could I hide the rest? How could I warn the authorities without tipping them off? That's when I heard voices. Close. Too close. I didn't even have time to think, just react. I darted across the room, heart pounding, and wedged myself into the narrow laundry closet, tucking into the shadows as best I could. It wasn't ideal, but it was all I had. Then they entered, Sharon and Butcher. I watched through the thin slats of the closet door as they made their way inside, whispering and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. They were there to poison me. To kill me. And in that moment, any lingering guilt I had about what I'd done to the whiskey vanished. Whatever hope I'd held on to that maybe this was just a scare tactic, it was gone. They really meant to end me. They spent what felt like hours moving through the kitchen, opening jars, containers, drinks, anything they thought I might touch. They laced everything. I could hear them talking casually about it like they were planning a Sunday dinner, not a murder. But that wasn't enough for Sharon. She went to the fridge, pulled out lemons, and started mixing up a fresh pitcher of lemonade. I watched in silent horror as she stirred in what they called the clean dose, the one that wouldn't show up in an autopsy. She poured in enough to kill me 3 times over. If I hadn't overheard their plan in that loft, if I hadn't known what they were up to, I would have taken a sip of that lemonade without a second thought, and I would have been dead before the sun set. That's how close it was. Before leaving around noon that day, Sharon and Butcher grabbed the whiskey bottle, the one I had laced with the dewormer, and took it with them. I watched from a distance, hidden, making sure they were actually gone. Once I was sure the coast was clear, I stepped back inside the house. I didn't waste a second. I threw a change of clothes into a bag, just enough for a day or two in case I needed to disappear quickly. Then, I walked over to the counter and poured myself a glass of the lemonade they had so kindly prepared for me. I held it in my hand for a long moment, staring at the pale yellow liquid, imagining what would have happened if I hadn't known. Then I poured it down the drain, every drop. I left the empty glass sitting in the sink, just in case Sharon came back and checked. I wanted her to believe I'd taken the bait. The rest of that day I spent hidden out on the far end of the property, in one of the old sheds where I used to store fencing supplies. It was remote, overgrown, and hadn't been touched in years. I prayed nothing would happen that might force me to come out. No busted water line, no neighbor dropping in, no sudden emergency. I just had to stay put and let time do its job. I figured the gang wouldn't really dig into that whiskey until the evening. That gave the dewormer time to kick in. Truth be told, I had no clue how long it would take, or how sick it would make them. I just had to hope it would be enough to stall them. I didn't call the sheriff's department until nearly midnight. I wanted to be absolutely sure. When I finally placed the call, my voice was steady but my hands trembled. I told them there was drug activity on the ranch and I believed my life had been in danger. That was all it took. By the time the raid came through the next day, it was nearly noon again. The gang was already gone. They must have cleared out earlier that morning, maybe even before sunrise. But they didn't clean up after themselves. The sheriff's drug task force found enough evidence, chemicals, ledgers, burner phones, to issue a statewide APB. I gave my statement in full, not holding anything back. When I told them about Sharon's involvement and how deep she'd gotten in with the gang, I could see it hit some of them hard. I got plenty of sympathetic looks that day. And more than a few folks, lawmen and locals alike, quietly told me it was time to file for divorce. One of the deputies, a woman named Amanda, asked if we could go back to the house so she could walk through everything in more detail. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't exactly in the mood for visitors. But something in her voice, calm, confident, steady, it disarmed me. She had kind eyes. The kind that said she saw more than she let on. Amanda wasn't what most folks would call conventionally pretty, short red hair, a face full of freckles and wide, strong hips that came from years of real labor. But there was something undeniably solid about her. She carried herself like a woman who knew the land, who understood what it meant to work and to lose. I later learned her family had been ranching in that part of Texas for generations. She'd left for a while, spent time in law enforcement down in Houston, but had returned just the year before. Folks in town had already started whispering that she'd probably be the next county sheriff. When we got to the house, she stepped through the door and immediately noticed the 3 large trash bags sitting in the kitchen. Her eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the contents. I had emptied every single jar, bottle, or can that hadn't been factory sealed. If it could be tampered with, it was in that bag. I'd taken no chances. She turned to me, those sharp green eyes catching mine with something unreadable, respect, maybe? Or maybe it was understanding. "Smart man," she said softly. For the first time in days, I felt like maybe I hadn't lost everything. I exhaled slowly, not even realizing I'd been holding my breath. The moment Amanda's hand drifted toward the pitcher of lemonade still sitting half full on the dining room table, the words came spilling out of me before I could stop them. "Don't drink the lemonade. I think Sharon poisoned it." Amanda froze, her fingers stopping just inches from the glass. She didn't flinch. Didn't panic. Just looked at the pitcher, then back at me, calm as ever. "Oh," she said, like I'd just told her I'd run out of milk. "That would also explain the kitchen bags by the door." I nodded, letting out another shaky breath. Yeah. They didn't want to take any chances. She and one of her new friends spent well over an hour yesterday going through everything in the fridge, the pantry, lacing anything I might reach for. It was thorough, I'll give them that. But honestly, it felt like overkill. Amanda raised an eyebrow and I continued. If I hadn't overheard their plan, that first glass of lemonade would have been enough to drop me. Probably would have just looked like I had a heart attack, right here on the floor. I glanced at the empty sink where I'd left the decoy glass earlier. But I guess when you're dealing with city folks pretending to be criminals, they think if 1 dose of poison is good, 100 must be better. I tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Amanda studied me quietly for a moment, her eyes scanning mine, reading me like a seasoned poker player. Then, the corner of her mouth tugged into a small, knowing smile. "All right," she said softly. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." So I did. I laid it all out, the way I'd overheard their plot in the loft, how they planned to use an undetectable poison to cash in on a life insurance policy, how Sharon had planned to come back playing the grieving widow, owning the land and the money. I told her about the lemonade, the spiked food, and the whiskey bottle I'd tampered with in return. Not to kill, just to slow them down long enough for law enforcement to catch them in the act. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I didn't try to make myself look better. I told her I'd been terrified, plain and simple. That I hadn't seen a way out where I lived and they didn't die, or I didn't. And most of all, I told her I didn't want them hurting anyone else. Amanda listened without interrupting, not once. Her face gave nothing away, but I could feel it. She understood. She got it. When I finally finished, she gave a small nod and said, "We'll wait for the lab test to confirm everything." But she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I could see it in her eyes. She believed me. When she left about an hour later, she took all 3 of the trash bags with her, packed them into the back of her department vehicle like evidence from a crime scene. It wasn't official yet, but something had shifted. It was the first time in weeks that I didn't feel completely alone. And for about a week after that, Amanda and I, well, we were almost like old friends. The days that followed were eerily quiet. Too quiet. I didn't hear a word, not from the sheriff, not from Amanda, not from anyone. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a good sign, that no news meant progress. But deep down I started to worry. What if the gang came back? What if they'd figured out what I'd done? I kept my rifle within arm's reach, double-checked every lock on every door, and slept in short, shallow bursts. My peace was thin, always ready to shatter. Then, almost out of nowhere, I got word that the sheriff had pulled in the Texas Rangers. Turned out the case had blown up way beyond our sleepy little corner of Texas. With the drugs crossing state lines, it was now an interstate trafficking case, something federal agents were more than happy to sink their teeth into. When I finally picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office for an update, the tone was clear. Law enforcement had taken over. My part in it was finished. They had what they needed. I was told to stay put, keep my head down, and let the justice system do its work. And then came Friday night. Just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Amanda rolled up to my ranch. This time she wasn't in uniform. No badge. No cruiser. Just jeans, boots, and a loose-fitting flannel shirt. She looked different, relaxed, maybe even a little lighter. "I'm hungry," she said, stepping out of her truck. "I want a proper steak, a cold beer, and someone decent to share it with. If you can help me with that, I'll bring you up to speed on what's been going on." I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, I reckon I can manage that." 10 minutes later, we were in my truck heading to one of the better steakhouses just outside of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was the kind of place where the meat was always done right and the beer came in tall, frosty glasses. The news she brought over dinner was as satisfying as the meal itself. My butcher, Sharon, and the rest of the crew, they'd all been caught. But not in a raid or high-speed chase. No, their downfall had come quietly and painfully. They'd gotten violently ill just before leaving Texas. Amanda leaned in close over the table and told me it happened after they decided to sample a bit too much of their own stash. Or maybe it was the whiskey. Either way, it didn't take long before every last one of them was doubled over in agony. The hospital staff had never seen anything quite like it. They were all now in custody, locked up in a state prison hospital near the Arkansas border. But they weren't going anywhere, too sick to stand trial, let alone be transferred. The damage was extensive. According to Amanda, they were all in the late stages of renal failure. From their stomachs to their bladders, the expired dewormer I'd slipped into their stash had scorched their insides. They'd live, but only barely. Each one of them would now require weekly dialysis, strict medical care, and constant supervision for the rest of their lives. They were prisoners in every sense of the word. I didn't smile, but I let out a long breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. I whispered a silent prayer, not of vengeance but of relief. I hadn't wanted to kill anyone no matter what they'd done. I just wanted to stop them, to make sure they couldn't do to anyone else what they'd tried to do to me. I remembered what the old war vets in town used to say, taking a life changes you. It was a weight no one should carry unless they had no other choice. And now I knew what they meant. None of it ever got traced back to me. Not the whiskey. Not the barn. Not the vet meds. No one ever made the connection. If Amanda had any suspicions? Well, she didn't say a word. If Amanda had her own thoughts about what I'd done, if she had any lingering suspicions about that whiskey bottle, she kept them to herself. Never once brought it up. Never asked questions she didn't want the answers to. As for Sharon, well, she got exactly what she'd earned. Turns out she'd been fully initiated into the gang. She wore their colors proudly and even had the female members' tattoo inked into her shoulder. Proof she was no longer just playing along. She had gone all in. But that loyalty didn't matter once the walls closed in. Between the drug trafficking charges brought by the state and the federal indictment looming over their heads, she was staring down a sentence that might as well have been a death certificate. Right after our divorce was finalized, and just a few days before her trial was set to begin, Sharon called me from the detention center. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to pick up. For a second I thought maybe she was calling to apologize. Maybe even to explain herself. But no. There was no apology. No trace of remorse. Not for the lies. Not for the betrayal. And certainly not for trying to have me killed. The only thing she regretted? Getting caught before her plan worked. I listened in silence for a moment, then said the only thing I had left to say, "Enjoy your very long stay in prison." And I hung up. She probably laughed after that, thinking I was just the dumb country fool she could outsmart. But I'm sure her smile faded fast when her lawyer explained the full scope of the charges she was facing. And when the feds came knocking, she did what most cornered snakes do, she turned. She gave up everything she could about the gang. Names. Drop points. Supply chains. All in a desperate attempt to shave years off her sentence. But it did her no good. The juries, both state and federal, saw her for what she truly was: cold, calculating, and utterly self-serving. A woman who'd sold out her husband and her soul. In the end, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not even a glimmer of daylight left for her. Later, Amanda dropped by with the final lab results. The lemonade? It had been laced with a particularly potent form of methamphetamine, highly concentrated and lethal in even small doses. One sip would have stopped my heart. And it didn't stop there. 46 separate food and drink items in my house had been tainted. Each one tested positive for either meth or a similar compound. And every single item bore either Sharon's or Butcher's fingerprints. Those results were the nail in the coffin. By early summer I was free. Free in every sense of the word. The divorce was finalized. Sharon was locked away for life. And best of all, she hadn't gotten a single cent out of me. In fact, the court had awarded me a small townhouse in Houston, the same one she'd secretly kept behind my back, using it as a hideout, a love nest, and later, a stash house for the gang's operations. Going through it for the first time was like peeling back the last layers of a lie I had once called love. In the weeks that followed, I worked to reclaim what had been taken from me, piece by piece. I managed to recover most of my mother's stolen jewelry, hidden away in little boxes and tucked into drawers Sharon must have thought I'd never check. I even found a few pawn tickets tucked into one of her handbags, paper trails leading me to heirloom pieces I'd thought were lost forever. It was like retrieving bits of my past, one memory at a time. I also tracked down several missing pieces of antique furniture. Items that had vanished from the ranch slowly, one by one, over the years. Some I found at pawn shops. Others were listed online, being sold off as if they were meaningless. I bought back what I could. As for everything else, the clothes, the designer bags, the gifts from her biker days, I didn't want any of it. I handed it all over to the sheriff's department, but they didn't seem all that interested. After a couple of weeks, I called the Salvation Army and told them to come clear it out. Every last bit of it. I didn't even watch as they loaded the truck. I just stood on the porch and let it go. Life, slowly but surely, began to move on. At first, Amanda and I saw each other on weekends. We'd go for drives, make simple dinners, sit on the porch in silence. But then weekends turned into weekday afternoons, usually on horseback. There was something peaceful about those quiet rides across the open land, just the two of us and the rhythm of hooves. Those afternoons turned into long evenings. She started dressing a little differently, cut-off shorts, snug shirts that hinted at something more without trying too hard. I noticed, and I think she wanted me to. I responded in kind, not with words but with quiet gestures. One evening, without planning it, we simply looked at each other. She reached for my hand. I took it, and then we kissed. It wasn't slow or hesitant. It was the kind of kiss that said everything we hadn't yet spoken aloud. And before I knew it, she was in my bed. She's never left since. There wasn't any big discussion about becoming lovers. It just happened the way some things are meant to. Soon we started talking about the future. Amanda mentioned she wanted a small, quiet wedding. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. But she wasn't in a hurry, and neither was I. We had time. We were building something stronger than ceremony. We also started talking about selling the ranch. The land around us was changing. Subdivisions were creeping in from every direction. What used to be a 100-acre retreat was now a stone's throw from traffic lights and chain restaurants. We realized that selling here could easily fund a new beginning, 500, maybe even 1,000 acres somewhere else. Somewhere the land still whispered, where the stars still filled the sky. Amanda had quietly been looking for assistant sheriff roles in more rural counties. She wanted space, peace, and maybe one day a family. Recently, she got an offer from a place neither of us had ever heard of. A town called Lovett. It sounded made up, like something from a country song. But it was real. And we're planning a trip next weekend to check it out. It's funny how life works sometimes. You think you're stuck, beaten down, broken, and then, out of nowhere, it offers you a fresh pasture. A new start. A clean slate. Amanda is that for me. She's my wide-open field. My second chance. A spirited, loyal woman who knows the value of hard work, who can ride a horse better than most men I know, and who appreciates a good home-cooked steak dinner almost as much as I do. So that's my story, friends. If any of this spoke to you, if you've walked a path of betrayal, heartbreak, or healing, drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More stories are coming. Some sad, some sweet, but all true. Thanks for listening.